Good morning, a very happy new year to you all, and a warm welcome to this special Ford of Europe webcast. Today we're discussing a subject that's crucial to the way our societies will function in the future, not to mention the health of the planet too. Our subject is mobility, and we're coming to you appropriately enough from the heart of the City of London. Freedom of mobility in cities like this one is a subject that's become a key topic for public debate and discussion across our region, just as it has around the world. And with me today to talk about this subject and a series of mobility initiatives announced by Ford last night are two very special guests. Barb Samardzich is Chief Operating Officer of Ford of Europe, and Dan Hill is Executive Director of Futures and Best Practice for the Future Cities Catapult. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Well, over the next 15 minutes or so, we'll be talking about the mobility challenges facing Europe, both in social and economic terms. And we'll be hearing more about the news from the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas last night, made by Ford's CEO, Mark Fields, as well as how it will impact this region specifically. And then we'll be taking your questions for both Barb and Dan. So if you do want to ask a question, please type it into the small box under the picture on our dedicated web portal, which should be your current web browser page. We'll see the questions here in the studio as they pop up. I've already seen some coming through, and we'll try and answer as many as we can in the Q&A session at the end. So let's get underway. Now first, Barb, I'd like to ask you, if I may, to tell us more about last night's announcements.
Sure, thank you, Phil, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to share with you some exciting news that Mark Fields, Ford Motor Company President and CEO, outlined yesterday at the International CES in Las Vegas. This is not the first time that Ford has attracted attention at the annual Consumer Electronics Show. Mark was first there 8 years ago when Ford was the first car maker at the show at that time. He introduced Sync, Ford's in-car connectivity system. This year, Ford Motor Company and Mark Fields came to the global stage for innovation with a higher purpose, one that started more than 111 years ago with our founder, Henry Ford. Henry Ford's goal wasn't simply to build a strong business by introducing compelling products. He was also passionate about the opportunity to create a better society. Henry Ford believed that a good business makes excellent products and earns a healthy return, but he also proved that a great business can do all of that while creating a better world. At Ford, we drive innovation in every part of our business, and that includes taking a lead in addressing the mobility challenges that face people all around the world. Let's take a look at what Mark Fields said in Las Vegas just a few hours ago.
Let's start with what we mean by mobility. It is more about just getting and moving from point A to point B, because the world is changing. People interact in new ways. They share information very, very differently. And they consume products and services in more ways than we've ever seen before. So at Ford, mobility is far more than motion. It's really about progress. It's about human progress. It involves such things as moving food to the stores that you shop in every day, ambulances arriving at the scene of an accident to save a life, or making it to your daughter's recital on time. It's about getting to work, whether that involves a 3-hour commute or working from the local coffee shop. 4 important megatrends are driving our thinking around mobility. These 4 megatrends are changing the way we view innovation and mobility at Ford. And we've developed what we call our Blueprint for Mobility, which is a multi-decade vision for how we can do our part to help create a better world. And it involves experimentation right now, leading to an all-new model of transportation and mobility within the next 10 years and beyond. We see a world where vehicles talk to one another, where drivers and vehicles communicate with the city infrastructure to relieve congestion, and where people routinely share vehicles or multiple forms of transportation for their daily commute. And to get there, today we're announcing Ford Smart Mobility, which is our plan to use innovation to take Ford to the next level in connectivity, in mobility, in autonomous vehicles, the customer experience, and big data. And a first critical step is the creation of 25 mobility experiments across the globe, all designed to help us change the way the world moves. So 25 experiments, 25 opportunities to start creating new transportation solutions to help make people's lives better and to create a better world through Ford Smart Mobility. Now, will we crack the code on our first try? No, probably not. And you know what? That's okay, because it's part of innovation. And as we drive innovation in every part of our business, we're determined to learn, we're determined to take risks, and we're determined to challenge custom and question tradition and change our business going forward. We've given our engineers, scientists, and technologists a challenge. And we've asked them to use innovation not just to create better products. We've asked them to innovate to make the entire transportation experience easier, to make people's lives better, and in doing so, create a better world.
Well, that was Ford CEO Mark Fields speaking in Las Vegas just a few hours ago, and I think you'll agree there's plenty to elaborate on there today. Barb, I'd like to come to you in a moment, if I may, to talk about what that will mean for Ford over here in Europe. But first, what exactly are the mobility issues we face in Europe, and how do they affect society and economic growth? Well, I'm delighted to be joined by someone who is a leading authority on exactly that. Dan Hill is the Executive Director of Futures and Best Practice for the Future Cities Catapult, which is an organisation that deals with urban innovation. Good morning, Dan. What's your take on European mobility?
Thanks. So the interesting thing about Europe is that much of it's already built. Probably about 80% of Britain's built fabric in 2050 is already here. And there's little appetite anywhere really in Europe for major new road building, particularly in the middle of cities. And yet London will add another Birmingham's worth of people in the next 15 to 20 years or so. So we have to do more with less, but fortunately mobility is always in flux. It always has been. If we look at Europe, roads were always built along the existing modes, like tram lines, which were in turn built around routes that existed for centuries. And the patterns of those previous versions of mobility are all too visible in our cities. In Castlefell in Manchester, it's possible to stand in a place where you can see 4 or 5 layers of movement stacked on top of each other. The canal, which is based along the old pit pony routes. There's railways on top of that. There's light rail on top of that. There's communications networks on top of this. So they're all threaded together. I've been lucky enough to live in Helsinki and Treviso near Venice in Italy, in London, but as well as Sydney, where I can compare it with a non-European mode, if you like. And I think the way the car integrates into European cities is far more fluid and balanced in a funny way. Australian cities like Sydney, which are very car-based, somehow more at threat or more fragile. Richard Weller, the architect, said that the suburbs of Australian cities are like the city that cars built when we weren't looking. And European cities maybe handle the mix of modes better. It's been doing it for a longer time with many more things going on. And maybe that's a clue to the future there. So we also know those cars are sometimes an awkward visitor in those European city centres there, particularly because they're so old. So that's the pattern in Europe to some degree. We know it's very different in the developing world, which is based on different dynamics altogether. Despite being that awkward visitor occasionally, the car has led to great personal freedom, urban growth, strong industry, and in Europe as much as anywhere else. We know the positive impact the Model T had on much of the century that followed. It freed people up in terms of where they could live and work, and alongside modernism was this whole new way of living in cities. And people sometimes forget that cultural value. The French philosopher Roland Barthes said in the late 50s that cars are the great Gothic cathedrals of our age. So it had this immense kind of cultural impact. We also know, though, that the car led to congestion, to sprawling cities, to health problems like obesity and air pollution to some degree, high carbon noise, redundant use of space, particularly car parking in cities, which takes up a lot of space in a very awkward way. The psychological impact of commuting, accidents. We know the issues, the price of that freedom in a sense. Congestion costs Europe around 100 billion euros a year, probably primarily in urban economies. In the UK, we don't really know the true figure, obviously, but it's somewhere between 10 to 30 billion pounds a year. Some suggest in London alone it could be around 10 billion pounds a year, though, to the London economy. Air pollution costs the UK 10 to 20 billion pounds a year in terms of health costs, with a large chunk of that coming from vehicles. Europe, that's up to 149 billion, so there's huge costs there associated with it. There are other costs too. In Sweden, couples in which one partner commutes for longer than 45 minutes are 40% more likely to get divorced. And if the average driver in Beijing now has a 5-hour commute, it's amazing anybody stays married in Beijing at all. So all these technologies, including the car, reinforce city living though. They do it in ways that are both positive and negative. The challenge moving forward to how we address this is kind of clear in a way for the 21st century. We at least at a system level, we need this increased flexibility and diversity of mobility to match the way that we now work or play or shop. We're a far more diverse society than we used to be. This means, in the language of the trade, a seamless multimodal approach. So switching between public transport, active transport, on-demand transport in very fluid ways. Bike, bus, tram, light rail, heavy rail, car, boat, even for logistics and personal transport, all of those accessible. And we can see glimpses of that emerging with the new urban services like Uber and Airbnb, this kind of so-called sharing economy. Which is almost really what I think is the Internet of Things. It's physical things being accessed or affected by Internet dynamics. And this gives us a clue as how people increasingly expect things to work. They expect autonomy, flexibility, convenience, things on their terms, easy access, mobile, pay-per use, predictive, even. Autonomous vehicles are likely to exacerbate that trend in some years, but this is all here now as well. If you look at an app like Citymapper here in London, a startup here in London, it integrates all the major modes of transport in London very fluidly. It's on probably half the smartphones in the city, and in a funny way it makes the city feel different, like more accessible, but without building any new infrastructure, physical infrastructure. So we still see the need for this mass transit and this multimodal thing. I mean, Uber won't scale as well to cover all of the demands of a city. And we'll also likely we'll see cars continue to be highly valued as cultural objects. It's clear that people like cars, but perhaps in future they could be driven more for fun, more for pleasure, more for cultural value, if you like how it looks in the adverts. And mobility in general as a utility in terms of getting people to work and those menial jobs, if you like, is shared across a much wider range, more flexible range. So you have different vehicles for different tasks. When you need to access the van for the annual trip to IKEA, you access the van. You need the estate car for the family camping holiday. You need the little shuttle for the trip to visit your granny or whatever. In Europe, maybe there'll just be less commuting by car as compared to, say, the US or Australia or East Asia. Currently, we kind of fold all of these demands into this kind of Swiss Army knife approach to the car. It has to do all of that stuff. And Swiss Army knives are great at being Swiss Army knives, but it's probably not the best approach for something as big and hungry and every day as the car. So 21st century mobility looks like this is kind of a mix, a lattice of sort of 21st century modes overlaid onto the 20th century, if you like. You still have this mass transit of the tube or the bus, but all of the journeys in between those things is done by this much more fluid mix of on-demand mobility, fulfilling awkward routes that mass transit doesn't scale to, on-demand, off-demand, high peak, low peak. Sharing, autonomous and so on, all these modes work in those gaps. The car remains, but there was much diversity of models and ownership as there is now in our society. In the 50s, UK and Europe was not a particularly diverse place, and car ownership accordingly was very homogeneous. Now we've explored diversity as a society in all directions, and mobility needs to follow that trend. Now what that really looks like in detail, no one really knows, which is why we need to prototype, why we need to test. It's great to hear about these experiments that Ford's doing here today. It's no longer a case of just launching a car at an unsuspecting public and getting Don Draper to market it incredibly well. It's not how things work now. We need to test and iterate and respond. And that means collaboration. Doing anything in a city means wrangling multiple stakeholders together to test things on the street and then scale. The benefits of all of this are spatial, so far more fluid use of space, particularly that, again, the more autonomous or on-demand modes, we're likely to be able to obviate the need for car parking altogether to some degree. And think about all the land value that releases back into the city, which could be other things entirely, far more productive use of space. There's huge economic benefit for cities there. It's a far healthier environment, of course, less noise, no air pollution, low to no carbon, far more active transport, healthier people. It's safer, fewer accidents, and it's difficult to measure how transformational that change could be. And more diverse ownership models again. So the car is still here, but it's able to kind of thrive at doing what it does best, perhaps, within a much wider range of mobility options. So it's no longer this kind of beast of burden in Swiss Army knife mode, but just the car. And that's a new mobility economy emerging there, essentially, with the dynamics of the tech sector, this so-called Internet of Things movement. And it's a newly mobile city as well. The great architect Louis Kahn once asked, in a very architect kind of way, what does a brick want to be when trying to think about what buildings should be? And we think this new kind of mobility, this connected, agile, fleet of foot, touching the ground more lightly, diverse, accessible, it's probably more like the way deep down that cities actually want to move.
Fascinating. Thanks for those insights, Dan. Fascinating to hear talk of, I suppose, both the financial and social cost of mobility issues, but also nice to hear some solutions there. And speaking of potential solutions, we heard, Barb, last night from Mark Fields that Ford is committed to 25 separate experiments looking at solutions around mobility. How many of those experiments will be taking place here in Europe?
Well, certainly several of them, Phil. In many ways, Europe leads the way in thinking about mobility. But our urban mobility systems are also the most mature, which means we need to be thinking a long way ahead about solutions. So it's fitting that no fewer than 7 of our smart mobility experiments are taking place here in Europe, and they fall into 3 categories. The first, learning about drivers' behavior to create a better experience for all road users. Secondly, using data to connect people in a collaborative way and a rewarding way. And the third, looking at more flexible ways to use vehicles.
Okay, so let's take a look at that. Let's drill down into that a little bit if we may. And starting off with that first category, how can learning more about drivers' behaviour affect the insurance rates that they pay?
Sure. Phil, this revolves around learning more about how our customers go about their day-to-day lives using their cars. Learning from your behavior and driving style, plus the external things that affect your driving experience, like traffic congestion and weather. We call the first experiment data-driven insurance. What if you owned a database of your driving behavior for every year since you passed your driving license? What if that driver's score passport could go with you from car to car, no matter which brand you chose? Imagine that you could share that data with insurance companies to get better rates. In order to better understand the business opportunity, we're collecting driver data from a large vehicle fleet in London. And because external factors, such as weather and traffic, have a major impact on drivers, we're factoring them into assessing how the driver acts behind the wheel.
Okay, sounds good. Now, I know the second experiment has to do with something that any city dweller has, it's an issue that they're painfully aware of. It's also something that Dan touched on earlier, and that is the pain that is parking.
Yes, absolutely, that's right. Parking isn't just a pain for drivers, it's also an issue for local authorities in every town and city. We want to move away from parking being all about fines and enforcement towards a hopefully more positive experience for everyone involved. Our second European experiment explores working in a socially collaborative way with local authorities. It's called painless parking. In this experiment, drivers use a plug-in device that relays live data on traffic and parking. It monitors and analyzes data in real time, and it helps drivers find the nearest open parking spot. Now, to make this work, we're partnering with the winners of our recent London Traffic Tamer app challenge, a tech startup called AppyParking. So let's hear from one of its founders, Dan Hubert, for a little more about how it works.
Parking in any city, especially London, is a complete and utter nightmare. There's 33 London boroughs. They all have different signposts and different regulations, so for a consumer trying to drive in and understand the rules, it's just almost impossible. We decided to take it upon ourselves to filter all this into one place and create one sort of data set. AppyParking is sort of like the UK's only holistic approach to parking. There are guys who just do one thing off street or bike bays, but we decided to take it and look at the whole picture. Amazing gravitas, basically, to have the global car manufacturer working with a startup of 2 people is quite an amazing relationship. So imagine you've arrived in Golden Square in central London, you open up the app, it immediately shows you all the parking bays around. You can also show car parks, motorcycle bays, electric, disabled, petrol stations and off-street as well. So once you're happy with that, then you can also see that the single yellow lines and paid bays are not free until 6:30 and the residence bays are 24-hour control. So once you confirm you want to park in that destination, you just simply go onto the pin and it gives you the prices and the tariff and the hours, and then you can just launch and pay by card. My vision for the future is to make parking feel like it never happened.
It's a really fascinating app, isn't it, that one? Great idea. Now, Barb, you mentioned there are also an experiment to do with using vehicles more flexibly. Does that mean car sharing?
Yes, Ford is exploring flexible mobility options around the world, beyond just selling and leasing cars. We've been working on and learning from car sharing programs for some time. The Ford car sharing scheme was launched in Germany in late 2013, and it's the first manufacturer-backed nationwide car sharing program incorporating dealerships. This collaboration was expanded recently and now involves 39 participating dealers in 55 cities with more than 100 locations. What's unique is that working in partnership with our dealers, we're able to serve smaller towns and villages in rural areas, not just the big metropolitan cities. But for those of us in big cities, owning a car can be difficult and expensive, and many cities have introduced congestion schemes. For example, if you drive here in London between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. on weekdays, you have to pay a congestion charge of £11.50 or just under €15 a day. We want to know which car sharing models work best, not only for consumers, but also for individual cities. The City Driving on Demand experiment is exploring flexible, shared usage of vehicles with cars positioned around the city. They can be used spontaneously for as little or as long as required and then dropped off in another location. For the pilot, we are focusing on using our Ford Focus Electric and our fuel-efficient Fiesta EcoBoost cars. Both are well suited to the urban environment. Users pay for them by the minute, and they don't have to worry about congestion charges, fuel, insurance costs, as they are all included in the price. And here's a quick video that explains exactly how it works.
GoDrive is an experimental platform. It's all around car sharing, and it's all about really observing what consumers want from this exercise, how they react, what they like, what they don't like. So we're starting small. We're starting with a series of experimental phases, and we're experimenting with different sites around the city to make sure that the sites are exactly where customers want the cars to be, rather than where the manufacturer wants the cars to be. We want to show that we can develop a car sharing model that works with the city for the citizens of London. We can go hub to hub. So the network of hubs in the eco-space will allow people to not worry about having to go back at the end of their journey. And I think that will be a significant advantage versus some of the schemes that have been introduced in the past. So our app is extremely simple, and through just a couple of clicks, recognizing the very convenient sites that we're using, we'll encourage people to use it. And I think that will cut down congestion, and it'll promote low emission driving through our electric vehicles and our EcoBoost engines.
Now, one thing I've noticed from the experiments that we've talked about so far is that they all deal with passenger cars, which I suppose you might expect from a company like Ford Motor Company. It sells a lot of passenger cars, but are all the experiments in the Smart Mobility series to do with passenger vehicles?
Oh no, not at all. In fact, here in London as well as in New York, we are piloting something called the Dynamic Social Shuttle. It's an on-demand service that offers one-way journeys. It's intended to be more convenient than a bus and better value than a taxi. And in Lisbon, as part of our Innovate Mobility Challenge, we asked developers to come up with clever ways to improve the ways goods and services are delivered. the winner of the Lisbon City Mobility Challenge, Smart Taxi, created an app which uses continuous analysis of live data to predict which areas will have the highest demand for taxis, helping drivers connect with new fares. We're very excited about what we're already learning and what these experiments can teach us, as we at Ford help to address real mobility concerns for European countries in the future.
Thanks, Barb, and thank you, Dan. Well, now it's time for us to open up the proceedings and to take your questions for both Barb and Dan. If you want to ask a question, please type it into the small box under the picture on your web browser page. We'll see the questions here in the studio as they pop up, and we will take as many as we can over the next 20 minutes or so. So please bear with us as we get around to your specific question. So let's start. I can see we've already got questions coming in, and okay, the first one is for you that I'd like to take, Barb. It's
Sure.
coming from the Netherlands, and this is it. The question is, all the new systems must decrease the amount of cars to get better air conditions and to decrease the amount of traffic jams. On the other hand, car companies want to sell more cars. Is this not a contradiction? Good question, eh?
So it's a great question, thank you. First of all, I'd say it's not about selling more cars. It's about having mobility solutions that are affordable and accessible to consumers. That's really the business that we're in at Ford Motor Company. And being able to do that means recognizing our responsibility to the environment, to improving congestion, and to all the things that having cars can potentially create. You know, I'd point out we have cars today that have zero emissions. We have electric vehicles that are available to our consumers. So we definitely have the technologies to address the air quality and the types of things that the person sending the question in was asking about. Now it's pulling that all together creatively, working with governments, working with infrastructure, and working with external partners so that we can integrate it into the mobility solutions of the future.
Thanks for that, Barb. Dan, a question here for you, one that I think has come in from London. I think you can tell from the tone of the question. You mentioned most of the infrastructure is in place. Do you think we can get cities like London moving again? And what do you see as the solution?
I actually think for its size and its age, London moves pretty well. Generally, I've been around a couple of thousand years and there's nearly 10 million people here. So I think we're doing a pretty good job in a sense. I guess what I was trying to get at is that you can't imagine, if we were having this conversation in the 50s or the 60s, we might be talking about building new flyovers and carving streets through Soho that we see out the window there. It didn't really happen then. It's certainly not going to happen in the future. It doesn't seem there's any appetite for building en masse lots of roads in the heart of cities like London or many European cities. So what we've got to do is do more with less. London's going to grow. It's probably like with Moscow, the only big mega city in Europe, it's growing pretty rapidly. So what's interesting, I think, building on what Barb was saying, is how do we enable people to access mobility generally across a wide range of services? When you need to take the tube, take the tube. The buses are there as well, and the buses in London are every 2 minutes or so from most places, kind of extraordinary. And then there's room for cars, there's room for bikes, there's room for walking. There's all kinds of ways that we can thread our way through this kind of medieval cityscape in a 21st century way. So using the dynamics of software, I think we can actually be far more effective about how we use the existing built fabric and certainly actually increase the mobility in London.
Okay. Here's an interesting one, Barb, for you. What does Ford's plan mean for the way it retails vehicles? Are we going to see cars sold in a different way as a result of these smart mobility experiments, do you think?
Well, I think we're already seeing differences in the way cars are sold. Just the connectivity, the Internet of Things, have changed the dynamics between a potential customer and a dealership in dramatic ways. So I think the short answer to the question is yes, and that's why we've integrated dealers into some of our experiments, like our car sharing experiment. And rather than hook up completely outside of the dealer network, we said this is an opportunity for them to grow their business also, and integrating them and bringing them into our experiments and working with them to find the right business proposition for their customers. That means it's also going to be a good business proposition for them is really important.
And does that get good feedback from retailers, from your Ford
Absolutely.
showrooms?
Absolutely. They're watching what's going on in the mobility space, and they're asking the same questions that the person who wrote the question in is asking. So they're looking to work with us and to make sure that we get solutions that have viable business propositions for them, as well as the right solutions for their customers to retain those customers.
Okay, so it's making sense to your retailers. I've had another question come in again from the Netherlands. So hello to all our viewers in the Netherlands. Thanks for sharing these questions. Keep them coming in, and please, elsewhere in Europe, get in touch with us. But this one says, does projects like this, I guess these social smart mobility experiments, do they cost money? Do you expect to be able to make a viable business model out of them for Ford, for example, with car sharing?
Well, any research does require some funding and resources put behind it to make it effective. But that's what you do to develop the technologies and the offerings that you're going to have for your customers in the future. So that's investment in your future for your company. So it's absolutely crucial that we continue on with experiments like this. And the whole point in doing this broad range of 25 experiments globally, the 7 we're doing here in Europe, we've got 8 in North America, 7 in Asia, I think we've got 2 in excuse me, South Africa, and we've got another one in South America, is for us to understand what works for our consumers, and that's going to dictate how we spend our money in the future on developing products and needs for mobility solutions for them.
Okay. We've had another one in from the UK, and the questioner asks, how long will these trials last, and what will be the barometer of success? Are these trials long-term solutions?
We actually look at most of the 25 experiments that we've got running right now as being completed towards the end of this year. So this is such a fast-moving space that you have to be able to understand where the opportunities are, understand how you play in those opportunities very, very quickly, or it's going to pass you by. So we're actually hoping most of them come to conclusion by the end of this year. We thoroughly expect some of them not to work out, and for some of them not to represent viable opportunities for us and for our consumers going forward. But that's good. That learning is equally as important as probably the minority of them that will turn into future business opportunities for us, our consumers, and our dealers.
And Dan, in your experience, do experiments like these, are they sincerely gone into by organisations that are ultimately commercial organisations?
Absolutely. I think there's no way of figuring out a good product or service in the 21st century unless you're testing things on the ground with real people, real stakeholders. Trying to get things to work in cities involves multiple public agencies, private players as well, and people, real people. You can't address that theoretically. We don't know how people will react to car sharing or autonomous vehicles, semi-autonomous vehicles, these kinds of sharing economy services, unless you prototype and iterate. So it's if you like, it's that kind of the way that the tech industry develops and releases and refines products over time in relationship with people. That's affecting the way that basically all other industries begin to think about things, even government. So you only find out whether it's a viable commercial product but by testing in that way. You only find out the kind of social or economic or cultural value by testing in that way.
Okay. Now I've got an interesting question here talking about technology. We want technology to be accessible, but we don't want more buttons in our cars. How do we get around that problem, Barb?
Well, one of the things that we already have available for our consumers is our sync system, which has voice connectivity. So virtually everything you want to do, whether it's play a particular piece of music, make a phone call, get traffic directions, you can just do it through voice command. And that voice command enables the driver to keep their eyes on the road and their hand on the wheel, which is ultimately what you want with someone in a vehicle. So I think those technologies can actually work hand in hand. And we've learned, and we've actually learned some hard lessons on how consumers interface well with the HMI, the human machine interface, what works well for consumers, and what turns into there's more buttons here than I want to know about. So this is just too much for me. And I think as we've progressed that interface, it's become more and more hands-free, more and more vocally activated.
Okay. Now, we've got someone here who's quoting Mark Fields from Vegas last night, so I'll read what he's written. Our priority is not in making marketing claims or being in a race for the first autonomous car on the roads, Mark Fields said. Our priority is in making the first Ford autonomous vehicle accessible to the masses and truly enhancing customers' lives. When can we expect a full autonomous car from Ford? Which models will get this technology? Thanks in advance.
Sure.
The big question.
So first of all, what Mark is really quoted there as saying is a reflection of Henry Ford's fundamental vision for transportation, which was, and for his company, which was to open the highways to all mankind. So he wanted to make and wanted to continue to have Ford provide accessible transportation solutions to its customers. So in terms of autonomous vehicles, first thing I would do is highlight we have numerous autonomous features on our vehicles today, available virtually across our entire range, from our smallest to our biggest vehicles. We have lane keeping assist. We have collision avoidance with pedestrian protection. We have active city stopping, so that if something runs in front of you, the vehicle will apply the brakes if you're not doing it. So we have these technologies as part of our vehicles today. All of them are ultimately, the control is designated to the driver, so the driver can have them on. The driver can take over if that feature starts to activate and take control of the vehicle. What we don't have yet on the roads is fully autonomous, where the driver doesn't participate in anything. We'll probably be available to have vehicles that can do that within, I would say, a 5-year time frame, because again, it's combining all these technologies that are out there today, adding the additional ones we're working on with our experiments. But it's not just the car that has to provide that capability. There has to be the infrastructure available to accept it also. So if I'm going to have a vehicle that's completely autonomous, it's got to talk to the infrastructure around it. It's got to talk to the vehicles that are around it. So it's got to have a communication system that works across that forum. And that communication system, I think, is probably more critical in having the plans to get in place on a global basis than the individual technologies that the car manufacturers are clearly going to be able to provide in the next few years.
Okay, so 5 years was the rough figure, but we'll have to kind of stay tuned to work out if that
we would say from a car perspective, with the technologies in a car, in around 5 years. But does that mean the infrastructure is there to accept it? That's what we still have to work on, and say, when will that be available to accept it?
Right.
And if I can add to that, Phil, I think that's where it comes back to this collaboration point again, because the infrastructure in the street environment is not under the control of the manufacturers. That's under local authorities, in this city, Transport for London, players like this. And many of those are interested in, well, how do we create a kind of a sensor-equipped environment that could support that kind of application, if you like, running on it. So a lot of the trials we're involved with is working more on that supportive infrastructure that you can then test these projects again. And it's not something that any one entity can do. It requires multiple people coming together to deliver that. That's why it's going to take longer than 5 years.
I mean, it strikes me as a bit of a headache, because if it is down to sort of city authorities, to national authorities or local authorities, Europe is such a tapestry of different countries, of different cities. How can they work together in order to kind of devise a standard? Is there any work being done in that area?
Yeah, I mean, there are industry-wide bodies. There are Europe-wide. A lot of European Union funding is looking at supporting how would you create a vehicle-to-city infrastructure that works across the entire region to enable new companies to emerge, but also cities to work in that way. So, yeah, there are huge efforts trying to do this, because somewhere in there is the answer to mobility in European cities. And everybody knows the costs associated with that. So there's big investment, there's a lot of will, but again, we're working with sometimes medieval cities, albeit in 21st century clothes. And we're working with multiple stakeholders, private and public, and citizens as well, who also want to understand, well, why would we spend money on this as opposed to something else? They might want an autonomous vehicle, that's underlying the question, but then to have that, it's going to mean changing the way that our cities work, actually. So it's not easy, but the opportunity is enormous.
Okay. Barb, you mentioned these 25 global smart mobility experiments, 7 of which are here in Europe, some of them which will wrap up by the end of the year. Do you expect, asks one question here, that these projects will result in actual real applications? Do you expect these experiments to become a reality?
That's absolutely what we're hoping. I mean, that's the whole point of any experimentation and investigation that a manufacturer like Ford would go forward with, is that at the end, we're looking to find the technologies for us to invest in for our future, for our business and for our customers. So absolutely, that's what we're expecting for a large part of these at the end of this.
Okay, great. A question just dropped in from Germany, and it's directed to you, Dan. There's a lot of talk of organising future traffic. Wouldn't it make more sense to think about how traffic as a whole could be reduced? Many thanks for answering, they say.
It would be good. It's difficult because, again, some of our cities are growing, so there is increased demand on the existing system. But I guess what we're interested in is, again, how to use 21st century dynamics or software, if you like, to make that system work more effectively. There's a lot of redundancy built into the system. Again, if you look at the average time a car is actually in use, it's a small percent of its life, just as with power drills and lawn mowers. You know, we use them for a tiny percent of the time we actually own them, and the other time they're sitting around. And they're sitting around in car parks, which is prime urban space quite often, which then again isn't in use all the time. It's in use for a small proportion of its time. It's highly valuable land. So we're interested in not necessarily adding more or less traffic. Maybe we can do this with fewer vehicles on the road, but in same number of trips or increased access to mobility, but using it smarter, effectively. An on-demand system should mean that we don't all have to have a car waiting just in case we want to use it. We can call it up when we need to at that point, which means that we can use multiple systems to solve mobility. So I think increased mobility, possibly increased movement, or certainly easier movement, but within the existing system or within the limits of it.
So do you think there's any hope of ever reducing traffic flows in developed countries like Western Europe, or is that just beyond the pale?
No, I mean entirely. No, obviously some cities are shrinking in Europe as well, so it's only a condition of growth to some extent where you see that massive increase in demand, and we're seeing that less in Europe than in other continents, so it's more of a problem elsewhere to some extent. But I think that, again, the question is possibly how do we ensure that people can move around in the way they want to move it around, but with fewer resources being expended to do that. Now that's entirely possible now because software enables the transaction costs of that to drop through the floor. That enables entirely new businesses, entirely new models to emerge around that.
Okay, thanks Dan. One question dropped in my inbox here for you, Barb. How can you introduce Ford Smart Mobility to the world as a new mobility concept when other car companies also work on new concepts? Is it not better to work together with other car manufacturers to find solutions? Because now every car brand says that it has a solution for all the problems. So, a strong question there.
Yeah.
But working with other car companies, is that something that Ford has considered?
Yes, certainly. And we do have relationships in vast areas of our business with other car companies. And as we talked about, having that infrastructure that can communicate with every individual car on the road means that we have to communicate with the vehicle in front of us, whether it's a Ford or not, the vehicle on the side of us, whether it's a Ford or not. So it's going to take that collaboration across OEMs to develop the system to work together, or
OEMs
none of
being
them.
manufacturers.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, from
car
our
manufacturers.
from other car manufacturers.
Right.
Otherwise, none of us will be able to execute the automated vehicle hardware and technologies that we've developed. So I think there's a strong incentive for us to work together, and we have different forums that we do come together to set standards and the types of things that will be necessary for us to be successful.
And I think you can also see this again in the technology industry. The major players work together to develop a standard like USB, for instance, which enables us to plug in all of our devices now. Apple and Google and Intel and everybody, they all supply engineers to work on those efforts, because that kind of shared infrastructure enables all boats to rise, if you like. It's good for all of the businesses involved.
Fascinating stuff. That is, though, all we have time for this morning. I'd like to thank Barb Samardzich and Dan Hill for being here in the studio. And I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to join us, and indeed for participating in our Q&A session. Thanks for emailing in those questions. I hope that you'll join us again in a future Ford of Europe webcast, but until then, have a very happy and successful new year, and see you soon.